ATP is the universal chemical energy currency of the cell. This means that no matter how we consume our energy, whether it's carbohydrates or proteins or lipids, our bodies, our cells, will convert it to ATP, and this ATP will then fuel every reaction, every process in the body that requires energy. So ATP fuels muscle contraction as well. One molecule of ATP has enough energy in it to power one cross-bridge cycle. So myosin grabbing one actin and pulling it close to the end line. Energy is released from ATP when it is hydrolyzed into ADP and an inorganic phosphate molecule. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So basically looks like an adenine molecule with tri for three phosphates attached to it. Cells access the energy contained within this molecule by cleaving this last inorganic phosphate off, generating energy. Most of the energy is contained in this chemical bond. So you're left with adenine and two phosphates, ADP or adenosine diphosphate, di for two, and an inorganic phosphate. Myosin is able to hydrolyze ATP, and when it does, it stores the energy within the myosin head. The ATP will remain attached during much of the cross-bridge cycle, helping to strengthen that bond between myosin and actin. While the inorganic phosphate is released earlier, a new ATP molecule must bind to myosin before that cross-bridge is released. So without more ATP, myosin will remain associated to actin. Rigor mortis is when no new ATP is produced due to death, and the muscles experience fused contractions as the cross bridges do not release and stiffness occurs. This cross-bridge induced stiffness does not go away until the proteins in the muscles start to break down. Here we can focus on the role of ATP during the cross-bridge cycle of contraction. It is a cycle, so we can really pick anywhere within the cycle to start. It's somewhat arbitrary. Here we have no attachment, right? But the attachment site is exposed. So calcium has been released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It has bound to troponin and gotten tropomyosin out of the way. Cross-bridge formation occurs when myosin grabs on to that binding site, or attachment site, or active site. Then myosin is going to use the energy it's already gotten from the ATP. As you can see, it's already been broken down, right? We've got not ATP here, but ADP and inorganic phosphate. So it's already accessed the energy, just like cocking a gun. inorganic phosphate drifts away, strengthening that cross bridge. Then we have the power stroke. Woohoo! Power stroke. That chemical energy contained in the myosin head is used by it to move, shifting closer to the M line and then sliding the thin filament over it. This ADP remains attached and the cross bridge remains until a new ATP molecule binds to the myosin head. Then we have hydrolysis of that ATP. Myosin is breaking it down into ADP and that free phosphate. So now it's charged up. Hasn't used that energy, but it's there. And then it will reorient itself so it's able to grab onto another actin of the same thin filament and perform that same action over again. And this cross-bridge cycle will continue until we don't have any calcium there and the attachment site is covered back up and or we run out of ATP. So, in general, zooming a little bit out, muscle cells or fibers require ATP not only for this cross-bridge cycle, so myosin pulling actin, but also for powering that sodium-potassium pump, which maintains resting membrane potential, and the calcium pump of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You need to pump all that calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum from low to high concentration, maintain the high concentration there, and that requires ATP. ATP is quite unstable. So the cell is only able to store enough ATP for 5 to 6 seconds of contraction. That's not long. So most contractions are going to require more ATP, which can initially be provided by either phosphorylating ADP, so recycling ADP that's left over, or breaking down a storage energy molecule called creatine. That'll get you about 15 more seconds. But then the cell needs to generate more ATP. This can occur from anaerobic or aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is the production of ATP in the cytoplasm without oxygen. Stick an A or an an in front of something, it means without. This will fuel contractions or intense short-term exercise. Aerobic respiration occurs within the mitochondria. It does require oxygen, and it nets a large payout of ATP, though it does require more time to do so. During normal conditions, the cell is fueled this way, so most exercise is going to rely on this aerobic respiration. Overall, during a muscle contraction, when we look at the sarcomere, the areas where there is no overlap, where there's only thick or only thin filament, will shorten. Overlap increases. The A band remains the same length as the A band spans the entire thick filament. So the thick filament, the thin filament don't shorten. It's just that overlap between the two increases. The H zone where there's only thick, the I band where there's only thin will get shorter as a result. As we've already touched on, the striations of skeletal and cardiac muscle are because of the sarcomeres, the arrangement of thin and thick, actin and myosin into sarcomeres. Smooth muscle does have these proteins as well, but they are not organized into sarcomeres. All this contraction generates heat as a byproduct, and our bodies use this to maintain temperature homeostasis. This diagram from an earlier edition of the book shows what's happening to the sarcomere. So I kept it in here because it's a good visual. Here we had the sarcomere at rest. The muscle is not working or contracting. We have a prominent I band where there's only thin filament, H zone where there's only thick, M line would be here. And we have a considerable amount of overlap, of course. But that overlap is going to increase as the contraction increases, to the point that in a fully contracted muscle, you don't see any H zone, and you barely see a little bit of I band. Due to the shape of the Z disc, it doesn't fully go away, but it does get much smaller than when the muscle is at rest. Contractions are triggered by twitches. A twitch refers to a single contraction episode where we'll see a full contraction followed by relaxation in response to a stimulus. A twitch has separate latent contraction and relaxation phases where the muscle contracts, stimulated, then it fully relaxes before another contraction occurs. Now, this is only a couple milliseconds, and it does not produce a contraction long enough to accomplish any meaningful work. Any meaningful contraction will be a result of tetanus, a sustained contraction where the muscle is stimulated rapidly and does not have time to relax. So as a muscle is stimulated, and again, this is on the order of milliseconds, so very short time, we'll see a few twitches, which will then start to fuse, and then we see complete tetanus where the muscle is fully stimulated, and we can do something with that muscle. This results in tone, which is constant tension over a long period of time. This is responsible for our upright posture, the upright muscles of our back, holding in the abdominal muscles. Fatigue is a temporary state of reduced work capacity. Its function is to tire out our muscles before muscles become damaged. It's a result of decreased ATP availability, whether that's less being produced or more being used up, oxidative stress, which results in free radicals that damage the cell, and local inflammation. That respiration also results in increased acidity or acidosis, which contributes to fatigue. We may feel sore after intense exercise. This is due to the release of inflammatory chemicals, as well as damage to the sarcomeres of muscle fibers. Z discs may tear, other structural proteins may be damaged, and the body has to repair this before we can engage in such intense exercise again. Muscle fibers are not one size fits all. We have two basic types that differ in structure and function. Slow twitch fibers contract slowly, as the name suggests. They also fatigue slowly. They rely on aerobic respiration because the cell has time to be supplied with oxygen and break down glucose fully in the mitochondria. The energy is supplied from fat, which does take longer to break down. Slow twitch fibers are darker, redder in color because of myoglobin. Myoglobin, like hemoglobin, binds temporarily to oxygen, so the cell can be provided with oxygen for aerobic respiration. This would be the dark meat of a chicken or turkey. Fast twitch fibers contract quickly and fatigue quickly. They rely on anaerobic respiration, much quicker than aerobic, and don't need to spend time supplying the cell with oxygen. No time for that. Energy comes from glycogen, which is much quicker to break down into glucose. Fast twitch fibers do not have as much myoglobin or as many mitochondria or as extensive of a blood supply, so they appear lighter in color and would be the white meat of a chicken. In poultry, there's parts of the body that consist of dark or white meat. If you think about it, the thighs are dark meat, the legs are dark meat, while the breast is white meat. And if you think about how a chicken moves, it makes sense. Chickens are mostly walking around, so they have these slow, sustained contractions in the legs. However, they are capable of short bursts of flight to, say, escape a predator or get up into a tree to roost. For that, they rely on those fast twitch fibers to generate quick but powerful contractions. In humans, we don't have entire muscles that are composed of either slow or fast twitch fibers. We have a blend. But the amount varies per muscle. If we rely on those muscles more for slow, sustained, low-intensity contractions, they'll have comparably more slow twitch fibers. So the muscles we rely on for posture, the back and the abdomen, will be an example. If we rely on the muscles for more intense, quick, powerful contractions, like the muscles of the upper limbs, the muscles will be composed of more fast twitch fibers. While the distribution of fibers is genetically determined, and one can't be converted into the other, depending on what types of activities we engage in, we might see more slow twitch fibers or fast twitch fibers develop. We've concentrated on skeletal muscle, but we do have two other types of muscle. Cardiac muscle will be talked about in more detail in the heart chapter of the cardiovascular system. So there's a whole chapter for it, but we'll touch on it a little bit more here. Again, only found in the heart. It is striated like skeletal muscle, though the striations are less distinct. The cells are fibrous, but instead of being cylindrical, they branch, and they are much shorter than most skeletal muscle cells. Because they are shorter, typically there's one nucleus that's centrally located in the middle of the cell. There's a large number of mitochondria to provide ATP through aerobic respiration. Cardiac muscle cells have intercalated discs, which are cell connections consisting of many gap junctions and desmosomes. Gap junctions allow ions and electrical currents to pass from cell to cell, so the heart can act as a unit. The desmosomes strongly link neighboring cardiac muscle cells together so they won't come apart during these forceful contractions. Cardiac muscle cells are capable of stimulating each other, and in this way they can regulate each other, and the heart is controlled and functions as a unit. Smooth muscle is found lining our hollow internal organs, the GI tract, the bladder, the uterus, as well as the vessels, and found in the eye. Smooth muscle does not have striations because it lacks sarcomeres. It does contain actin and myosin, but those are bundled and distributed throughout the cell, so contraction is going to look like this, with the cell just shrinking like a slug from all directions instead of shortening. Smooth muscle consists of small, short cells that are spindle-shaped, thicker in the middle and tapered at each end. Like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is involuntary, meaning that it's under unconscious control. It's capable of being stimulated by neurotransmitters and hormones.